My name is Hussein, and I thought I had everything figured out. I was wrong. I had always been certain of my path in life, my faith, my beliefs. Everything was clear, or so I thought. Islam was my foundation, the religion I had followed since childhood without question. I prayed 5 times a day, observed every fast during Ramadan, and read the Quran with unwavering conviction. I never doubted the teachings I had been raised with, because in my mind, they were absolute truth. Christianity was something foreign to me, a belief system I had been told was corrupted, altered by men who twisted God's message. Jesus, I was taught, was a prophet, nothing more. I never thought to challenge these teachings. There was no reason to. My life was stable, my future seemed secure, and I saw no need to look beyond what I had been taught. But what I didn't know was that every certainty I had, was about to be ripped away in a single moment. It was an ordinary day, one that should have ended like any other. I had just left work, tired but eager to get home. The streets were busy, filled with cars, rushing in every direction. The city never slept, and neither did the honking horns, the blinding headlights, or the voices of impatient drivers weaving through traffic. I had done this drive countless times, barely thinking as I moved through the familiar roads. My thoughts were elsewhere, on the things I needed to do that evening, on the conversations I had earlier that day, on the plans I had for the weekend. I didn't notice the danger coming. I didn't see the reckless driver speeding through the intersection. I didn't even have time to react. The impact came with a force so sudden, so violent, that I had no chance to process what was happening. One moment I was gripping the wheel, focused on the road ahead, and the next, everything turned into chaos. The deafening sound of metal crushing against metal filled the air. The world spun violently as my car was hurled across the road, glass shattering, tires screeching, the weight of my body thrown in directions I couldn't control. My vision blurred, my mind scrambled, and then silence. At first I thought time had frozen. Everything around me seemed distant, muted, almost unreal. I was still there, still in the middle of the street, but something felt wrong. The pain I expected never came. No burning, no agony, no suffocating pressure. Instead, there was only a strange stillness, an emptiness that left me weightless. I tried to move, to lift my hands, to get out of the car, but as I turned my head, a sight more terrifying than the crash itself made my breath catch in my throat. I saw my body. It was lying motionless behind the shattered windshield, slumped over, blood trickling down my face. My own eyes were half open, but lifeless, staring into nothing. My limbs hung at unnatural angles, as if they no longer belonged to me. The sight sent a wave of horror through me. But even then, I refused to believe what was happening. This had to be a dream, a shock-induced hallucination, something my mind was making up to protect itself from the trauma. I wasn't dead. I couldn't be dead. Yet, as I tried to reach out, to touch the car, to grab hold of something, my hands passed through the metal as if it wasn't even there. Panic set in. My heart should have been pounding, but there was no heartbeat. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but no sound came from my lips. The scene before me unfolded. Like a movie I had no control over. People rushed toward the wreck, shouting frantically, their faces contorted with shock and concern. Someone was on the phone, calling an ambulance. A woman knelt beside my body, pressing her hands to my chest, trying to do something, anything, but it didn't matter. I wasn't there. I was standing outside of it, watching. It started happening more and more. At first, only a few, then dozens, then more than I could count. Some came in secret, afraid of what would happen if they were caught. Some had already lost everything, willing to risk it all to hear the truth. I saw it happening before my eyes, the prophecy unfolding, the awakening I had witnessed in my vision becoming real. Mosques that once stood full were beginning to empty. Families that had never once questioned their faith were now whispering about Jesus behind closed doors. The very people who had once rejected even the mention of his name were now desperate to know more. The resistance was still there. The darkness still fought back, but it was losing. The light was breaking through. And through it all, I knew this was why Jesus sent me back. I don't know who you are, where you come from, or what you believe. Maybe you stumbled onto this by accident. Maybe someone sent it to you. Maybe you're here watching, and you don't even know why. But I do. You are here because Jesus is calling you too. I was once blind, convinced that I had the truth when I had only ever known deception. I lived my life in certainty, never realizing that everything I believed was built on lies. I was given the chance to see, and now I am giving you that same chance. You may think it's impossible. You may think there's no way what I'm saying could be true. I understand. I was where you are now. But ask yourself this: why are you still here? Why haven't you turned away? Why is there something inside of you that isn't letting you leave? That's not an accident. Jesus is waiting for you, just like he was waiting for me. You don't have to stay in the darkness. You don't have to live under deception. You don't have to wonder anymore. The truth is here. And now, it's your choice to make. I turned, desperate for an explanation, desperate to wake up from this nightmare, but instead of waking up, I felt something, a force, unseen but undeniable, pulling at me. It wasn't a hand or a person. It was something deeper, something stronger than gravity itself. It wrapped around me like an invisible current, tugging at my very being, pulling me away from the wreckage, away from the street, away from the world I had always known. I tried to resist, tried to hold on to something, anything, but there was nothing solid, nothing to grasp. The harder I fought, the stronger the pull became, until I had no choice but to surrender to it. The sirens grew distant. The voices of the people trying to save me faded. The flashing lights, the sounds of the city, the very world itself. Everything was slipping away. Darkness surrounded me, but it wasn't empty. It was vast, endless, stretching beyond anything I could comprehend. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but there was no one to hear me. My entire life, I had believed that upon death, my soul would be judged by Allah, that angels would come to question me, that I would be taken to either paradise or torment. But where were they? Where were the angels of Islam? Why was there only this empty void, this relentless pull, dragging me further and further from everything I had ever known? I felt myself being carried somewhere, though I could see no destination ahead. The fear in my chest grew, swelling into pure terror. This wasn't what I had expected. This wasn't what I had been taught. And yet, there was no denying it. This was real. I was dead. I had left my body behind, and now something was coming for me. I thought I was still alive, but I wasn't. I tried to move, but my body, if I even had one anymore, felt weightless, like I was suspended in something that had no beginning or end. The city, the flashing lights, the chaos of the accident. They were gone, dissolving into a darkness so vast that it swallowed everything. There were no streets, no sky, no ground beneath me. I was drifting, or maybe I was falling, It was impossible to tell. The pull, that invisible force that had dragged me away from my body, wasn't letting go. It was stronger than gravity, stronger than anything I had ever felt. And no matter how much I resisted, I couldn't fight it. Panic surged through me as I struggled against it, twisting and reaching for something solid, something familiar, but there was nothing to hold on to. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this death? Was this the moment my soul was being judged? Every teaching I had ever learned told me that after death, I would be questioned by the angels, Munkar and Nakir, who would ask about my faith. They would demand to know who my prophet was, what my beliefs had been. And yet, as I drifted further from everything I had ever known, I realized, with growing dread, that I wasn't hearing their voices. The silence was overwhelming, deafening in its absence of sound. I had expected something, flashes of memory, a vision of paradise or torment, a sense of where I was going, but there was nothing but this terrifying, endless pull. I wasn't floating freely. I was being taken somewhere, sucked into a tunnel of darkness that had no visible walls, but felt like a passage, as if I were being funneled through something unseen. It was no ordinary blackness. It had depth, movement, an eerie sensation of motion that I couldn't control. The fear inside me grew into something unbearable. Where am I? What's happening to me? My voice, if I even had one, did not echo. It did not bounce off anything. It simply vanished into the emptiness around me, like a whisper swallowed by the wind. I expected to see something soon. Anything. The angels, the gates of paradise, the punishment of hell, whatever my fate had been meant to be. I had spent my life believing that Allah was the one true God, that the words of the Quran were final, that Muhammad was the last and greatest prophet. And yet, as I continued falling through this endless tunnel, the thought gnawed at me, where was he? Where were the angels of judgment? Why had no one come to meet me? The tunnel twisted. Or maybe I did. The force pulling me grew stronger, more relentless. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The darkness split, not into light, but into something different. It wasn't a void anymore. It was a presence, something vast, overwhelming, powerful beyond anything I had ever encountered. I had felt the presence of Allah in my prayer, or so I had believed. But this was unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't distant. It wasn't silent. It was near, close. It knew me. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't turn away. My soul, my very being, was exposed before it. And I realized I had never been more vulnerable in my life. It wasn't just watching me, it was seeing through me. Past my words, past my prayers, past everything I had ever done or believed. There was no place to hide, no room for denial, no mask to wear. The truth of who I was, of what I had believed, of what I had ignored, was laid bare before this presence, and I could do nothing to stop it. Then I saw him, and I knew everything was about to change. The presence was overwhelming, unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was not just power, it was truth itself, radiating through me, exposing every part of me that I had spent a lifetime hiding, even from myself. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. It was as if my entire being had been paralyzed, not by fear, but by something far greater, something that went beyond my understanding. And then, through the suffocating weight of that presence, I saw him. I knew who he was before my mind could even form the thought. It wasn't because I had studied him, not because I had ever believed in him. In fact, I had spent my life rejecting him, dismissing him as just another prophet, a figure distorted by misguided followers. And yet the moment I laid my eyes on him, something inside me broke. I knew, I just knew, this was Jesus. Not Isa, the prophet I had read about in the Quran. Not the man Islam had reduced to a mere messenger. No, this was something entirely different. This was Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I couldn't stand. My knees gave out beneath me, and I collapsed before him, not out of choice, but because no one could stand in his presence unless he allowed it. Every single fiber of my being screamed in recognition, in awe, in something I had never experienced before, complete and utter submission. Not to an idea, not to a religion, but to the truth standing before me. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough. But when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that shook the very core of my soul. "Hussein," he said, calling me by name. The way he spoke it was as if he had known me before I was even born, as if he had been watching over me my entire life. There was no anger, no condemnation in his voice. There was only a deep sorrow, an indescribable sadness, as if he was mourning something. "You have been deceived," he said. The words struck like lightning. They shouldn't have meant anything to me. They should have sounded absurd, but they didn't. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew they were true. Still, I fought against them. I shook my head, even as my body trembled, even as my soul quivered under the weight of his gaze. "No," I managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. "No, this can't be. Islam is the truth. The Quran is the final revelation. Muhammad is the last prophet." I repeated these words, not just to him, but to myself, clinging to them like a man trying to hold onto a rope that was fraying apart in his hands. If I let go, if I even considered the possibility that everything I had believed was wrong, then what was left? Jesus didn't argue. He didn't need to. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to convince me with words. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He showed me. And what he showed me shattered everything I had ever believed. The moment Jesus lifted his hand, everything around me shifted. The weightless void, the overwhelming presence, the crushing reality of where I was, it all faded into something else entirely. I was no longer standing before him. Instead, I was moving, pulled through something beyond time, beyond space, as if I had been taken outside the very fabric of reality itself. Then I saw it. I was no longer in the darkness. I was standing in a different place, one that felt so real, so vivid, that I could feel the air move around me. It was ancient, like stepping into a time long forgotten. The land stretched out before me, rocky and dry, the kind of terrain I had seen in historical documentaries about Jerusalem. And then my eyes landed on him, Jesus. But this time, it wasn't the glorified Jesus I had just seen. It wasn't the powerful presence that had stopped me in my tracks. No, this was a man, beaten and bloodied, stumbling forward under the weight of a massive wooden cross. The sight of him, of his body covered in wounds, his skin torn apart from the lashes of Roman whips, his head crowned with twisted thorns digging into his flesh, it made my chest tighten. I had read about this before, but the way Islam had described it was nothing like this. This was real. I could see the agony in his eyes, the way his body trembled with exhaustion, the way the people around him mocked and spit at him. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was being forced to watch, as the Roman soldiers dragged him forward, as he fell to his knees under the weight of the cross, as they yanked him up and forced him to continue. I wanted to scream at them to stop, to fight for him, but no one could hear me. I was just an observer, a witness to the very moment my entire belief system had denied. Then the scene shifted. I was standing at Golgotha. The sky had darkened, the air was thick with something I could only describe as sorrow itself. And there, before me, was the cross. Jesus was hanging from it, his body broken beyond recognition. Nails had been driven through his hands and feet, holding him in place as he struggled to breathe. The crowd below was split, some mourning, some mocking, some simply watching in silence. And among them, I saw his followers, his disciples, their faces streaked with tears, their bodies shaking from grief. I wanted to scream, to tell them this wasn't real, that Jesus was never crucified, that Allah had taken him up to heaven before this moment. That's what I had been taught. That's what I had always believed. But I couldn't say it, because I knew, in that moment, I had been lied to. The truth hit me like a hammer to the chest. This wasn't a vision. This was reality. Jesus had been crucified. He had died on that cross. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't someone else in his place. It wasn't a deception. It happened. And then I saw something even more powerful. The moment Jesus took his final breath. The ground beneath me trembled. The skies cracked with thunder. The veil in the temple was torn in two. The entire world reacted to his death. This wasn't the death of an ordinary man. This was something far greater. Something I had been blind to my entire life. And then I saw the resurrection. The scene shifted again. This time, it was 3 days later. The tomb. The stone rolled away. The women arriving in shock. Jesus was alive. I saw him appear before his disciples, saw the joy and disbelief in their faces, saw the holes in his hands as he lifted them to show them the truth. I watched as he spoke to them, as he gave them instructions to go into the world and spread the gospel, the real gospel, not the altered message I had been taught in Islam. I felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. This wasn't just a story. It wasn't just history. It was the truth. But before I could even process it, Jesus showed me something else. Time moved forward. I saw the apostles spreading the message, saw how the world was transformed by the truth of Jesus Christ. But then, something changed. I saw another man appear, a man I recognized immediately, even though I had never seen his face before. Muhammad. He was standing in the desert, speaking to people, telling them that God had given him a revelation, that he was the final prophet. I watched as his message spread, as his followers grew in numbers, as they began rewriting history itself. I saw how Islam was created, and the deeper I looked, the more I saw the spiritual deception behind it. It was as if I had been given new eyes. What had once seemed like a divine message now looked completely different. Islam wasn't built on truth. It was built on distortion. I saw how verses were changed, how the message of Jesus was twisted, how billions of people were led away from salvation by believing a lie. I saw how entire nations were controlled by it, how generations were taught to reject the very truth that could save them. And then I saw the chains. They weren't physical, but they were there. Invisible chains wrapped around millions of people, keeping them bound in spiritual blindness. It wasn't just belief, it was captivity. And for the first time in my life, I understood why so many Muslims never even considered questioning their faith. They weren't just following Islam, they were imprisoned by it. I couldn't handle it. I fell to my knees, weeping uncontrollably. My entire life, I had thought I was serving God. I had prayed. I had fasted. I had defended my religion against anyone who questioned it. But in the end, I had been living a lie. I wept for the years I had lost, for the people I had judged, for the truth I had rejected. I wept because I knew there were billions of people just like me, people who had no idea that they were trapped, people who had been raised to believe they were on the right path when in reality they were being led away from salvation. Jesus stood before me again. His eyes were filled with something I couldn't even describe. Not anger, not disappointment, but sorrow. And yet even in that sorrow, there was love. And then Jesus showed me what is coming. The moment Jesus lifted his hand again, the visions before me shifted. The past faded, and in its place, I was being pulled forward, further and further, as if time itself was unraveling before my eyes. I no longer stood in ancient lands. The air around me changed, and suddenly I was looking at a world that was unfamiliar yet deeply connected to the one I had always known. It was the future. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Cities stretched before me, vast and endless, filled with people moving about their daily lives. The streets were crowded. The skyline was filled with towering buildings. The noise of humanity was everywhere. But there was something different, something I could feel more than I could see. A shift was happening. It was like the world itself was trembling beneath the weight of something unseen, something unstoppable. Then I saw it. It started small. A single conversation, a quiet whisper, a handful of people questioning everything they had ever believed. It was happening in a country where questioning Islam had always been forbidden, where speaking against it had always meant persecution, or worse. And yet these people were no longer afraid. Their voices grew louder. They began to seek, to search, to ask about Jesus. It was like a spark igniting in dry grass, small at first, but impossible to stop once it had begun. The vision shifted, and suddenly I was standing inside a mosque. But something was different. It wasn't filled with worshippers. It wasn't overflowing with men bowing in prayer. It was empty. Dust settled on the once polished floors, and the silence was suffocating. The place that had once been filled with the sounds of recitations, of sermons, of teachings that had ruled over so many lives was now abandoned. The call to prayer still rang out, but fewer and fewer people answered. And then I saw something that took my breath away. The mosques were being replaced by churches. I watched as people, once devoted Muslims, walked away from Islam and into the arms of Christ. Entire families stood together, their hands trembling as they clutched Bibles instead of prayer beads. Women who had spent their lives hidden behind veils now stood openly, their faces lifted toward heaven, their lips speaking the name they had once been forbidden to say, Jesus. The numbers grew. What started as a trickle became a flood. Millions of Muslims were converting. Entire countries that had been ruled by Islamic law were shaking under the weight of this movement. Governments panicked. Leaders tried to silence it, but the more they fought against it, the stronger it became. I could see the fear in the faces of those in power. They knew they were losing control. Persecution followed. I saw men dragged from their homes, beaten for confessing Christ. Women were cast out of their families, disowned for refusing to return to Islam. Some were imprisoned. Some were even killed. But not a single one of them recanted their faith. They stood firm, even as their bodies were broken, even as they were cast out onto the streets with nowhere to go. They knew the truth now. Nothing could take it from them. The vision shifted again, and I saw something even more incredible. The places I had once known, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Pakistan, these were the places where revival was spreading the fastest. The very countries that had worked the hardest to keep Jesus out were now the ones where he was being worshipped. In secret gatherings, in underground churches, in whispered prayers behind locked doors. I saw imams, the very men who had spent their lives preaching Islam, fall to their knees in surrender to Christ. I saw scholars who had once argued against the Bible, now defending it, with a passion greater than any Christian I had ever met. The world was changing. The truth was setting people free. But not everyone was rejoicing. I saw chaos, governments collapsing, religious leaders calling for desperate measures to stop what was happening. I saw riots in the streets, protests breaking out, violence erupting as the old world fought against the new. Countries that had once been stable now shook under the weight of their own deception being exposed. There was anger, rage, and an unrelenting attempt to hold on to what was slipping through their fingers. And then I saw the man who would try to stop it. At first, he was just a figure standing in the shadows, watching as everything unfolded. But as I looked closer, I saw him step forward. He was powerful, charismatic, and terrifyingly deceptive. He spoke words that made people listen, that made them follow. He promised to bring order back, to restore the way things used to be. And many believed him. Many followed him. I realized with horror that this was no ordinary leader. This was the one who had been foretold. The vision blurred again, and I saw something that sent chills down my spine. The world was on fire, not in the way I had seen it before, not with wars fought over land or politics, but with something much deeper, something that reached into the very souls of people. It was a war of truth against deception, a battle that had been simmering beneath the surface for centuries, but was now rising to the forefront in ways that no one could ignore. The moment millions began turning to Christ, the forces that had ruled over them for so long responded with fury. It was as if something hidden had been unleashed, something that could no longer pretend to be dormant. I saw entire governments shifting their focus, no longer just trying to control economies or territories, but trying to crush the truth that was spreading through their people like wildfire. It wasn't just about stopping conversions anymore. It was about maintaining power, holding on to the grip they had over the hearts and minds of those who had once followed without question. Religious leaders, the very ones who had preached peace and unity under Islam, were now filled with rage, desperation, fear. I saw them standing before crowds, their voices trembling as they warned their followers about the so-called corruption taking place. But the people weren't listening the way they used to. The truth had already started to take root. The harder they tried to suppress it, the more obvious it became that they were losing control. And then came the retaliation. It began with laws, new restrictions, new punishments. Entire governments changed their constitutions to make conversions illegal. In some places, owning a Bible became a crime punishable by imprisonment. Public confessions of Christ became acts of treason. Families were torn apart as those who had embraced Jesus were cast out by their own parents, brothers, and children. But when laws weren't enough, violence followed. I saw mobs forming in the streets, hunting down those who had left Islam. I saw churches, newly built, filled with those who had only recently discovered the truth, burning to the ground, their walls collapsing under the weight of flames fueled by hatred. I saw men and women dragged from their homes, beaten in public squares as a warning to others. Yet even as their bodies were broken, their faith never wavered. It was unlike anything I had ever imagined. There was no fear in their eyes. These were people who had once been like me, Muslims who had never questioned, who had prayed the same prayers I had, lived the same lives I had. And now, even as they faced death, they stood firm. They did not beg for their lives. They did not renounce the name of Jesus. They held on to him with a strength that could not be taken from them. But it wasn't just happening in one place. This war wasn't confined to a single country, a single region. It was everywhere, from the deserts of the Middle East to the streets of Europe, from the cities of Asia to the villages of Africa. The battle was raging, and then I saw the other side. It wasn't just human forces fighting back. This wasn't just about religious leaders, governments, or mobs. There was something darker behind it all, something that had been hidden, in plain sight. I saw shadows moving behind powerful leaders, whispers being spoken into the ears of those in authority, lies being spread with a force that seemed almost supernatural. This was more than just resistance. This was the work of darkness itself. I saw spirits, beings I couldn't fully comprehend. Their presence was like a suffocating weight that pressed against my soul. They weren't just influencing people, they were controlling them. And yet, for the first time, I could see them for what they truly were. Not protectors, not divine messengers, but deceivers. They had built the foundation of Islam, woven it into the minds of billions, kept its followers blind to the truth for generations. And now, they were losing their grip. I watched as these beings shrieked in fury, as they fought desperately to reclaim what was slipping from their grasp. But no matter how hard they fought, the light was breaking through. The war raged on, but the tide was turning. The truth had been revealed, and it could not be undone. And then I saw my own fate. I was still standing in the middle of it all, watching as the battle between truth and deception played out before my eyes. I had seen things I never thought possible, had witnessed the veil being torn away, revealing the reality of a world I had never truly understood before. I had seen millions waking up, their eyes opening to the truth they had been denied for so long. I had seen the fury of those who wanted to keep them bound, the desperation of leaders and forces that refused to let go. I had seen people lose everything for the name of Jesus, yet stand firm in a faith they had only just discovered. And I had seen the darkness behind it all, the real enemy, the one that had been pulling the strings all along. I had seen enough to know I never wanted to go back. For the first time in my existence, I felt peace. Not the kind of peace I had once sought in prayer, not the temporary calm that came after fulfilling religious rituals, not the fleeting comfort of believing I had done enough to earn favor with God. This was different. It was deeper, purer, more real than anything I had ever experienced before. In Jesus' presence, there was no fear, no doubt, no weight of uncertainty. I had spent my life struggling, always trying to be good enough, to obey enough, to believe enough. But here, in front of him, I didn't have to try anymore. I didn't want to leave. I turned to him, my heart pounding, the weight of everything I had just seen still pressing heavily on me. "I can't go back," I said, my voice trembling, not from fear, but from the deep, overwhelming knowledge that the life I had once known was gone. Even if I returned, I would never be the same. I couldn't go back to pretending. I couldn't go back to a world that had no idea of the battle happening beyond what the eyes could see. "Please," I whispered, "let me stay." Jesus looked at me, and for a moment, there was silence. Not an empty silence, not the kind that brings uncertainty, but a silence that held weight, meaning, something deeper than words could express. There was love in his eyes, a love that I had never known before, but there was also sorrow. "Hussein," he said, his voice steady, yet filled with something indescribable. "You have a mission." The words cut through me, sinking into my soul, in a way that felt like both a command and a plea, a mission. My heart ached at the thought. I had never wanted anything more than to stay in this moment, to remain in the presence of the one who had revealed the truth to me. I had seen the war being fought on earth, had seen the hatred, the rejection, the persecution, and now he was asking me to go back. I can't, I said, shaking my head. I don't know how. How could I live there again, knowing what I know now? They'll never believe me. Jesus didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me with explanations or reassurances. He simply looked at me, and in that moment, I understood. It wasn't about whether people would believe me. It was about whether I was willing to tell them anyway. If I went back, my life would never be the same. I would never again fit into the world I had once belonged to. My family, my friends, my entire identity, everything would change. I would face rejection, hatred, possibly even worse. But the alternative was unthinkable. How could I keep silent after what I had seen? How could I let others remain blind when I now knew the truth? Jesus extended his hand toward me, not forcing me, not commanding me, but offering me a choice. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. And then I woke up. I gasped for air, as if I had been drowning. My lungs burned, my chest felt tight, and every part of me ached, as if I had been crushed under something heavy. But none of that compared to the shock of being back. The moment I opened my eyes, the bright, sterile lights above me made me squint, and for a brief moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. The last thing I remembered was standing in the presence of Jesus, feeling his overwhelming peace, knowing I had seen the truth. But now I was here, back in my body, back in the world I no longer belonged to. I heard muffled voices around me, urgent, relieved, disbelieving. The sound of machines beeping, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant chatter of hospital staff. Then faces came into focus. My family, my mother, her face streaked with tears, gripping my hand as if she thought I might slip away again. My father, standing at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes red-rimmed but controlled, watching me with a look that was both relief and something else I couldn't quite place. My younger brother was there too, hovering nearby, staring at me like he had seen a ghost. "He's awake," my mother sobbed, squeezing my hand tighter. "Alhamdulillah, he's awake." The doctor entered, flipping through a clipboard, looking at me like I was some kind of medical anomaly. "Hussein," he said, his voice carefully neutral, as if he was trying to process something that didn't make sense. "You were in a very serious accident. We weren't sure you were going to make it." He paused, glancing at the monitors. "Frankly, I still don't understand how you did." I could feel the weight of their stares on me, the overwhelming relief in the room, but all I could think about was how wrong it all felt. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had been there, standing in eternity, in the presence of Jesus himself. And now I was back in a world that had no idea what I had seen. I swallowed, my throat dry and raw. My mother brought a cup of water to my lips, helping me drink, still whispering prayers under her breath, but I wasn't hearing them anymore. My heart was pounding, not from fear, not from pain, but from something burning inside me, something that hadn't been there before. Truth. I had to tell them. I opened my mouth, my voice hoarse but firm. "I died." The words felt heavy, even though I knew they were true. And I saw something. My father stiffened. My mother's grip on my hand faltered just slightly before she forced a smile, brushing a hand over my forehead. "You were unconscious for days, Habibi. It must have been a dream." The doctors said, "No, I shook my head, suddenly feeling more awake than ever. It wasn't a dream. I struggled to sit up, ignoring the soreness in my limbs. I saw Jesus. The room fell silent for a long moment. No one spoke. My father's expression hardened. My brother exchanged an uneasy glance with my mother, and I could feel the shift in the air. The warmth of their relief turned to discomfort. My mother let out a small, nervous laugh. "You were in an accident, my love," she said softly. "Your mind—" "I wasn't dreaming," I cut in. "I saw him. He spoke to me. He showed me things. Things I never understood before. He's the truth. Islam—" I hesitated, knowing what I was about to say would change everything. But I couldn't hold it in. I couldn't lie. Islam is not the way. Jesus is Lord. My father slammed his hand against the wall. "Stop," he said sharply, his voice filled with something I had never heard from him before: fear. I turned to him, desperation rising in my chest. "Baba, listen to me. I know what I saw. Jesus is the Son of God. Everything we were taught—" "Enough," he roared, his face dark with anger. "You don't know what you're saying." But I did. I knew exactly what I was saying. I turned to my mother, searching her face for some kind of understanding. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she was shaking her head. "You must be confused," she whispered. "You were hurt. You weren't in your right mind." "No, Mama," I pleaded. "I've never seen anything more clearly in my life." Her lips trembled. "You're saying—" She hesitated, her hands gripping mine, as if trying to pull me back from the words she knew I was about to speak. "You're saying you believe in him." I held her gaze. "Yes." She pulled her hands away. The room felt colder. My family, who had been surrounding me with love and relief just moments ago, now looked at me like I was a stranger, like I was dangerous. My father stepped back, his eyes filled with something I never thought I would see directed at me: disgust. My brother stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to process what he was hearing. "This is blasphemy," my father muttered, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're saying." I looked him straight in the eyes. "I do." He let out a breath, his hands clenching at his sides. "No son of mine will say such things in my house." I felt it then. The separation. The invisible line that had always existed, but had never been crossed before. I had always been their son, their flesh and blood. I had always been a part of them, bound by faith, by culture, by family. But now I was something else, someone else, and they didn't know what to do with me. My heart ached, but at the same time, I knew this was just the beginning. I had seen it already. The persecution, the rejection, the battle between truth and lies. I knew this moment was coming. I looked around at their faces, at the people who had raised me, loved me, and now feared me, and yet there was no doubt left in my heart. No hesitation, only conviction. Jesus was Lord, and I knew I had a choice to make. Leaving my old life behind wasn't a decision I made in a single moment. It was something that unfolded step by step as I realized there was no way to live in both worlds. I couldn't pretend to be the person I had been before. I couldn't go back to the prayers I once recited with conviction, but now knew had no power. I couldn't stay in the same spaces, surrounded by the same people, and act like I hadn't seen the truth. At first, I tried. I thought maybe I could keep my faith in Jesus a secret, that I could still be part of my family while holding on to the truth in my heart. I thought if I spoke carefully, gently, maybe I could help them understand. But the moment I had confessed his name in that hospital room, the divide had already formed. My father barely spoke to me. When he did, his words were cold, distant, like I had become someone unrecognizable. My mother still looked at me with tears in her eyes, still whispered prayers under her breath every time she saw me, pleading with Allah to bring me back. My brother kept his distance, his expression unreadable, as if he wasn't sure whether to pity me or resent me. The house that had once been my home now felt like a place I no longer belonged to. Then came the warnings. I heard them from my father first. His voice was quiet but firm, laced with an urgency I had never heard before. "You don't understand what you're doing," he told me one night. "People will talk. The community will know. You're bringing shame to us all." I had already seen it happen in my vision, the way the world fought against the truth. But hearing it from my own father cut deeper than I expected. "If you don't stop," he continued, his voice tense, "we won't be able to protect you." He didn't say what that meant. He didn't have to. I had grown up knowing the stories, the expectations. What happens to those who leave Islam? In some places, it was a quiet rejection, a silent cutting away. In others, it was much worse. That was when I knew I couldn't stay. The night I walked out of my family's house for the last time, I didn't take much with me. A backpack, a few clothes, nothing more. I wasn't just leaving my home. I was leaving everything that had once defined me. My name, my background, my culture, my past. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew who I was following. The first days were hard. I had no plan, no direction, no idea how to live as someone new. I only knew that I couldn't turn back. The world outside felt bigger than I remembered, both terrifying and full of possibility. I wandered through cities where no one knew me, slept in places that were never meant to be home. The loneliness crept in at times, but through it all, something inside me burned brighter than anything I had ever known. I had found the truth, and I couldn't keep it to myself. Somewhere along the way, I found others like me, former Muslims who had seen what I had seen. Some had been disowned by their families, left with nothing but the name of Jesus to hold on to. Some had been beaten, cast out of their communities, told they were dead to the people they once called family. And yet, despite all of it, they stood firm. They knew what I knew. They had seen what I had seen. Together, we studied. For the first time in my life, I opened a Bible, not as a skeptic, but as a believer. And the more I read, the more I understood. The words weren't just ink on a page. They were alive. The prophecies, the promises, the revelations, it was all there. And I had been blind to it for so long. But now I saw. And I wasn't the only one. At first, I only shared my story when people asked. It was never something I planned to do, never something I thought would change anything. But every time I spoke, I saw the same look in people's eyes, the same doubt, the same resistance, but beneath it all, the same hunger for something more. Some mocked me, others grew angry, accusing me of betrayal, of spreading lies. Some wanted nothing to do with me, wouldn't even listen, but some did. I remember the first time a young man pulled me aside after hearing me speak. His eyes darted around, his voice lowered as if he was afraid to even ask. "Tell me more about Jesus," he whispered.